Hello and welcome to the Marathon Medic podcast. My name's Amy and I'm a junior doctor and running coach with an interest in sports medicine. On this series of the podcast, we're talking about running and travel. On today's episode of the podcast, I'm sitting down with Dr Nathan Hudson-Peacock, an emergency and expedition doctor. We're chatting about some of the risks associated with more extreme sporting events, such as long ultramarathons or races in challenging environments. So hi Nathan, and thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be chatting about some of the risks and health problems that can occur from big ultra events. But before we start, could you just tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
So hi, thank you very much for having me on the podcast today. My name's Nathan. I'm a doctor. I work primarily in the emergency department, but I also have a special interest in expedition medicine with a focus on desert and high altitude, although I do dabble in other areas as well. And I myself recently got into running, so I'm very excited to be here and chat to you today.
Good. And can you tell us a little bit about why you suddenly started running and how that's been for you?
Yeah, so it goes way back to my school days, really. I always used to hate running. I thought it was possibly the worst thing to be spending my time doing on a Thursday afternoon at school, running in the rain, getting muddy, getting stitches left, right and centre, and thought it was generally not a very fun activity. Secondly, I always have had quite bad knees historically. My left knee used to lock a lot when I was a child, and it caused me some sort of anxiety around my knees. And then in university, I injured my other knee and ended up having an operation on that knee and being on crutches for about 4 months. And again, I sort of always used this commonly held belief that running is bad for your knees as an excuse to not actually take up running, because I didn't like it anyway. So that was how I got through most of my life, not really doing any running. And there was a couple of things really that made me challenge that. And firstly, it was getting into the whole expedition medicine world. I realised that I need to keep on top of my fitness, and that had become a lot harder since finishing university. Whereas at university, I was playing a lot of sport, keeping generally fit. After that, starting work as a doctor, I had far fewer opportunities to keep fit just through playing sport. And so something like running would have been a convenient way to keep fit. And through doing the expedition medicine, obviously as the doctor, you need to be at your peak fitness so that you're never a liability and holding back the team. You're always on top of your game. So running started to creep into my mind. I had a friend at university who took me on a couple of runs, and they were actually quite fun, and which kind of blew my mind. I think the most important thing was that we ran much slower. So we ran at a pace where we could comfortably talk to each other, which was, I don't think, anything I'd ever done in my entire life before that point. And she took me on a 5 kilometre run. And before we went, I said, no way, it's not going to happen. But then we went on the run and we went at a pace that meant we could comfortably talk, and actually managed it okay. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. It was actually quite fun. And so that sort of sowed the seed that actually I can run and it can be enjoyable sometimes. So then the thing that really made me start running regularly was actually on my expedition to Pakistan last year. So I was with a group of Irish trekkers, and we were going to K2 base camp, which is the base camp of the second highest mountain in the world. And then we were going from there across the Gondogorla, which is a high altitude mountain pass in that same region. And there were 2 participants on that trek who made me sort of reconsider my position on running. One was a chap who had spent his whole life running. He had competed internationally in his age category in the Commonwealth Games, I believe. And he said that firstly, it was his determination to run every day, despite being at high altitude, despite trekking for several hours a day. He still wanted to run. And it was because he hadn't missed a single day of running in 2.5 years. And
I'm not sure if that sounds healthy.
Well, exactly. And this was my belief. I'd tried a few times before that to take up running, thinking, I need to rest at least every other day. And it became really difficult because you manage a couple of weeks and then you fall out the habit because you think, I'll have an extra rest day, and then suddenly you're out of the habit again. But he made me realise that actually you can be a runner every day, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's an unhealthy thing. And there was another participant on the track who kind of on a similar vein said she used to hate running, but then she challenged herself to a 5k a day for 30-day challenge. And I thought, well, I know I can do a 5K because I've done it once and it wasn't too bad. And I might as well just try doing it every day. So I got back and thought I'll just give it a go. It's only 30 days and I'll see what happens. And, you know, bearing in mind, I'd been on probably less than 10 runs in my life before this point. I just thought I'd go for it, and I'm not going to lie, the first week or two were really quite painful. But after that, I started to get used to it and had this sort of identity shift in myself that actually I could be someone who runs on a fairly regular basis. I'd like to say I kept it up every day following that, but obviously I didn't. Sort of reduced in frequency, but it's kind of allowed me to see running in a different light. See it as something that I can do, something I can enjoy. And actually it's become something I do quite regularly now, at least a couple of times a week, just to keep on top of my fitness, my mental health. Gives me an opportunity to listen to podcasts. And yeah, it's a great thing to do.
Oh, I'm glad there was a shift. And I think also if someone runs every day, that's great, but we can also fit it into our own lives and we don't have to kind of conform to one idea of what running is. So it's nice that you've just balanced it with everything you're doing. How did you get into expedition medicine? Because that's something that's not really mainstream medicine. I feel like we have zero exposure to that through medical school. So how did you get into that path?
It was sort of by accident. I always had an interest in pre-hospital emergency medicine. Through my medical school days, I was interested in emergency medicine. I did my medical electives or my student selected components with different air ambulance trusts, and was a first responder at university. I was interested in the pre-hospital emergency medicine world, but I didn't know expedition medicine really existed at that point. It was only when I was a second year doctor and I was trying to find a way of getting some extra leave so I could go on a skiing holiday, and I'd already used up all my annual leave. Essentially, I found myself Googling medical conferences and ski resorts and stumbled across one on expedition medicine. Thought, that sounds relatively interesting, let's go along, at least I can get a week of skiing for some study leave. Unfortunately not paid study leave, but still it allowed me to go skiing. And in that week I heard lots of different talks from a range of incredibly inspiring people, from Lucy Obolensky, a doctor who's worked with David Attenborough, to Captain Nick Weatherall, another doctor who got an OBE for being the first all-female team to cross Antarctica. All these inspiring doctors who are doing incredible things with their lives that I just had no idea were possible as a doctor. And that created an entire shift in my sort of career trajectory from that point onwards. Instead of getting on the treadmill like so many of us do and applying for a training program and going through the motions to become a consultant in something or other at the end of the day, I thought actually expedition medicine seems like something I would really enjoy, and I want to dedicate at least a year to, you know, trying it out properly and seeing what it's like. And so I completely shifted my focus. I started working at events, ultramarathons in the UK, providing medical cover on trekking events in the UK to build up that skill set. And then eventually got my first job, which was on Mount Kilimanjaro. And soon after that got the Sahara Desert and then Everest Base Camp, and that sort of set the ball rolling. And as it was coming up to the end of that year, I realised that expedition medicine was so much more than just a break from my actual career. It was going to be something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
Nice. I'm thinking I really want to do that as well now after you said all of that. So talking about working in ultramarathons particularly, obviously there's loads of health benefits to running, and I think ultramarathons kind of encourages people to run slowly but for longer, which I think also has huge health benefits both physically and mentally. But we're going to talk about the risks and the problems that can happen for some individuals. So shall we start with kind of heat exhaustion and dehydration first? 'Cause I think they're the things that probably pop into people's minds the most.
Yeah, it's something that has received a lot of media attention and attention from sort of nutrition companies over the last few years as running has become more and more popular. And you know, social media platforms have certainly popularised the sport as well, and more people are taking part in not just marathons but ultra marathons in extreme environments such as the Marathon des Sables in the desert. And so it's really important that there is clear medical advice that goes with that to keep people safe. And heat exhaustion is something that we often hear about but we don't necessarily know that much about when it comes to running, and that was very obvious in the case of the Brownlee brother, Johnny Brownlee, in the World Triathlon Series in Mexico 2016. who just before he crossed the finish line actually started showing clear signs of heat stroke. And one of the signs is something called truncal ataxia. So that's where your cerebellum, which is the part of your brain that is essentially responsible for coordinating balance and muscle control, essentially overheats and stops working properly. And as he approached the finish line, you could see that at his waist, he was unable to keep himself upright. He was swaying side to side as if he were drunk, and he kept collapsing over and over again. And that sign that you see with Johnny Brownlee crossing the line there is classic heat stroke, and that's a life-threatening condition that needs aggressive cooling. But instead, everyone's cheering him on, encouraging him. His brother comes around the corner and carries him over the line, which was absolutely heroic, of course, and they came second and third place respectively. But that is something that actually needs to be recognised by the wider public, and in well publicised events such as that, there's obviously a medical team on hand at the finish line who can then start aggressive cooling, with ice baths and things like that. But actually a lot of people who are taking part in these events aren't often doing it as part of a massive, well-organised event with medical and so it's really important people recognise and know how to deal with it. So I think there are some other forms of heat exhaustion as well, which are not quite as severe as heat stroke, but they are all on a spectrum. And so it's important to recognise the signs and symptoms so that people can recognise that and start addressing it before it progresses to something more serious.
So what are the more subtle things that people might notice in themselves if they are starting to become overheated?
So some of the symptoms might be sort of nausea, vomiting, dizziness, muscle cramps, feeling a little bit confused and like you're unaware of your surroundings. And so, but the thing is, these can often be confused with other similar exercise-related illnesses, such as dehydration or even overhydration. So I think it's being aware of the risks as well associated with the environment you're in. So if you are running in a cool, dry place, then it's much less likely for you to get a heat-related illness compared to if you're running somewhere that's humid or somewhere that's hot. And they really do both matter, because somewhere like the Marathon des Sables, it's a very dry environment, and so people are slightly less at risk of getting a heat-related illness compared to somewhere like a jungle marathon where you've got such a high humidity that the body's natural cooling mechanisms, which relies on evaporation of sweat, aren't able to happen because they just can't compete with the humidity in the air, and so the body just finds it impossible to lose heat. And so it's being aware of the environment you're running in as well, and how risky they are in terms of heat-related illnesses.
And I think one of the best things people can do is acclimatise. So if you're planning a race in a different country with a different climate, then it's always advisable to go out before the race for a few days. If you can, weeks are great. And to just increase the duration of your exercise each day slowly, increase the intensity each day slowly, increase your exposure to the heat. So you could start one day kind of early in the morning and gradually go later and later. And then also just be aware of the gear you're wearing as well. So sometimes in these races, people are carrying these huge, heavy packs that are kind of stopping their sweat evaporating. So also just building that up gradually as well, which is obviously really difficult if you're flying out somewhere and going for a race. But ideally, if we can train in these climates, then obviously it will reduce the risk as well.
And even if you aren't able to get to the climate, just trying to replicate similar conditions at home, whether that is through, sessions in the sauna or layers on to simulate a hot, humid environment, these are all things that can help. For example, with altitude, there's a lot of varying gadgets that you might come across that all claim to help with acclimatization, most of which don't work. But there are some evidence-based mechanisms, such as using companies such as the Altitude Centre in London, which has essentially a hypoxic gym where you can go and train at altitudes up to equivalent of 5,000 meters. And there are sort of hypoxic tents that you can use to sleep in to help your body acclimatize ahead of time.
Yeah, so it's all about, I guess, planning and being aware of symptoms.
Yeah.
If someone feels like these symptoms are coming on, obviously in big races, you'd hope that there's a medical team nearby. Is there anything people can do if they do feel themselves experiencing some of these symptoms that they can while they're running or during the race?
Yeah, if you're on a race and you find yourself exhibiting symptoms that could be associated with dehydration, overhydration, heat-related illness, or even just exhaustion, then of course the easiest thing to do is to slow down and take a rest. And we mentioned just before we started recording this, one of the risk factors for all of these things is actually excessive motivation. And that is certainly a danger. If people are so determined to push through the pain and push through their unwellness, that's when things are going to start going wrong. So if you notice any of these symptoms, then it's definitely worth even just slowing down so you can take a rain check on how you're feeling, or even stopping and resting for a few minutes. That might be enough that you need to actually get on top of what you're feeling and get you back on track so that things don't take a turn for the worse.
Yeah, and I think if you spent the time acclimatising to the heat, you'll also know a bit more about how your body responds and what's normal for you. So hopefully you can then pick up on the signs that actually something isn't quite right. And it's so important to listen to your body and actually stop when you need to and not think,
Exactly.
I need to be first, because you're not going to be first if you're collapsed.
Exactly.
You mentioned altitude, so should we discuss races at high altitude next?
Sure.
What are the dangers of running at high altitude, and what does high altitude have in terms of effect on the body?
So the main change of high altitude is the lack of oxygen. So as you go up, the percentage of oxygen remains the same as at sea level, but the barometric pressure of the atmosphere decreases. So in a set volume of air, even though there's the same percentage of oxygen, the actual number of oxygen particles that you're breathing in goes down. And so what that means is your body is having to exercise in a hypoxic environment. When we're doing prolonged forms of exercise, we rely on aerobic respiration. So our muscles are using oxygen to produce energy. So if we are trying to do the same form of exercise at altitude compared to at sea level without having acclimatized, it would be much, much more difficult because the body is having to work much harder to get that same amount of oxygen to the muscles where it's needed. So your heart rate has to go up, you have to pump the blood around your body quicker, your breathing rate has to go up because you're trying to get that oxygen in and out of your lungs. And so there's quite a few difficulties that come associated with doing exercise at high altitude. And that's before you get on to the effects of the cold and the changeable weather conditions and often the uneven terrain and all of that.
And in terms of preparing for that, you mentioned a few things already about acclimatizing to high altitude. How long does it typically take for your body to acclimatize?
So acclimatization happens in several stages. With an initial ascent to altitude in the first 24 to 48 hours, your body responds by doing things it can do quickly. So the first things to go up will be your heart rate and your respiratory rate. You're moving air in and out of your lungs quicker and your body's pumping it harder around your body. And the other thing that happens within the first 24 to 48 hours is that you start diuresing. So your body is producing more urine than you would normally. And that is to essentially hemoconcentrate your blood. So it's increasing the concentration of hemoglobin within the blood and therefore increasing the amount of oxygen that is getting delivered to the tissues. So that's the effects that happen within the first 48 hours, which is why you often hear people say, when you arrive at a new altitude, try and rest as much as you can for the first 48 hours, drink plenty of fluids. After that, your body then starts to acclimatize in a slightly different way. The diuresis settles down and your kidneys start to respond by producing something called erythropoietin or EPO, and that stimulates your bone marrow to produce extra red blood cells, which increases the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. And this process starts to happen within the first week, but can take several weeks to reach the maximum effects. And so that's why you often find with high altitude expeditions, such as Mount Everest obviously being the highest, people often will stay at the base camp doing acclimatization rotations for a number of weeks, sometimes 4 to 6 weeks or longer, to allow their bodies the full amount of time to acclimatize to that low oxygen environment.
And if someone doesn't kind of do all of that, what are the risks of going to a high altitude area and not basically taking all of this advice? What can happen to the body?
So the most obvious and essentially undesirable effect of not acclimatizing properly if you're going to do a race is that you just won't be able to perform. Mm-hmm. You will be so out of breath you will have to stop, you won't be able to carry on, and even if you are incredibly determined and you do push through it, you won't be performing anywhere near your potential. So you aren't going to perform well in the race, and that's guaranteed. If you are actually okay with that and coming first or doing well in the race isn't your goal, it's actually just getting from the start to the finish, then actually there are other dangers which are to do with altitude related illness, and the most common form would be acute mountain sickness or AMS. But that can progress to something called high altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, which is where the brain starts to swell and is a life-threatening condition. There's also another condition called high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, again, another life-threatening condition, which essentially happens if you overexert yourself at altitude without giving your body enough time to acclimatise properly.
And what are the signs and symptoms that people might experience?
Well, the signs and symptoms of AMS, it's funny because a lot of these things overlap, but you'd find it's nausea, headache, lack of appetite, dizziness, lethargy. These are signs of the heat-related illness as well, but obviously if it's in the context of going to altitude, then it might also be altitude-related. When AMS becomes more dangerous and it turns into high altitude cerebral edema, the things to look out for are neurological signs, and that is confusion typically, and vomiting, and truncal ataxia. So that is that same sort of drunken movement, the lack of body coordination that you could see in heat stroke. And essentially they can look very, very similar. Coming on to high altitude pulmonary edema, the main symptom of that would be essentially shortness of breath that doesn't settle on rest. So normally at altitude, even, bending down to tie up your shoelaces can make you out of breath. But when you rest, your body should be able to settle down and you should be able to speak in full sentences without needing to take multiple breaths again. But if after 5-10 minutes you aren't able to settle down and you're still out of breath, that's sort of often the first sign of high altitude pulmonary edema. And that can then progress to developing a dry cough, some sharp chest pain, even pink frothy sputum that you're coughing up. These can all be signs and symptoms of high altitude pulmonary edema and are definite indications for stopping the race and getting down in altitude as quickly as you can.
I was going to say, it sounds like the most obvious answer to these problems is to get away from the altitude and head down. Is there anything else people can do?
If people are exhibiting symptoms and signs of altitude sickness, the worst thing to do is to carry on trying to race and also to stay at that altitude. As you continue exerting yourself, it continues putting essentially a pressure on the body where it's having to try and deal with the lack of oxygen at the same time as having to work hard, and that can actually exacerbate the altitude sickness. It means that the tissues, the muscles and the brain are getting even less oxygen than they should be getting because you're still trying to exercise. So, absolutely, if you're exhibiting these kinds of symptoms at altitude, the first thing is to stop and to rest, and the second thing is to get down in altitude as quickly as you can.
And just having kind of read a few ultra running tips and advice about these big events that are at high altitude, the general theme seems to be that people are advised to live at high altitude but train at low altitude so that they can kind of experience the effects of altitude while they're just going about their day-to-day lives, but push themselves at low altitude so that they don't kind of experience these symptoms and still get that training in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're at a high altitude, your body is working hard even just to stay alive, and the normal processes that would be involved in building up muscle as a result of training are compromised when you're at altitude, because instead of putting energy into making your muscles stronger and developing your respiratory muscles, actually what's happening is your body is just spending all of that energy on keeping you breathing at all and allowing you to acclimatise to the altitude. So when you're trying to train, it's often a good thing is to sort of sleep high and train low, which is the opposite message to when you're trying to acclimatise to altitude, which is often to climb high in the day and then sleep low.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of a subtle distinction there, which is worth bearing in mind.
I mean, it'd be really nice if we could all spend a few weeks before a race doing all of this acclimatization work. Yeah. Another side effect, I guess, of altitude is that it can add to dehydration, which we've already discussed. Mm-hmm. And we mentioned before kind of avoiding alcohol and caffeine to try and reduce the impacts of dehydration.
Yeah, so it's sensible advice when you're going to altitude to avoid alcohol. Obviously in a high altitude environment, it's a riskier environment and you don't want to be impacting on your ability to have quick reaction times and respond to the environment around you. But also alcohol is obviously very dehydrating, and the symptoms of hangover are frequently confused with the symptoms of AMS, and you don't want to be evacuating yourself because you're hungover rather than actually exhibiting signs of AMS before your race. Caffeine is an interesting one. So caffeine can cause it's a bit of a myth that caffeine actually dehydrates you. It entirely depends on the water content and the caffeine content of the coffee or the tea. So if you're drinking a shot of basically pure caffeine, that's likely to dehydrate you, but most people drink a coffee or a tea that isn't actually sufficiently high in caffeine to cause dehydration. And the other thing to bear in mind is that people often drink caffeine on a daily basis in the morning, and the body can become dependent on it. And what that means is if you were to suddenly stop drinking caffeine, you can exhibit withdrawal symptoms, which can be similar to altitude sickness, such as headache and lethargy. And so if you are preparing for a race and you've got a couple of months to get yourself ready, then it's worth trying to reduce the amount of caffeine you're drinking on a daily basis. However, if you are a regular caffeine drinker and then you go to take part in the race, it's not advisable to suddenly go cold turkey and not have your caffeine, because that will make you underperform, and it will also mean you probably feel pretty rubbish.
I think the thing I'm taking away from this is all these symptoms do overlap no matter what the cause, and then you're going to be a bit confused about what's serious and what's just a caffeine related headache.
Exactly.
Another thing that seems to be becoming more and more common is exercise related hyponatremia, which I think now a lot of races are advertising a little bit more, but I think it can be a difficult thing for runners to understand and then also know how to manage what they're drinking. So could you just chat a little bit about what hyponatremia is and how runners can best prepare?
Yeah, so in the bloodstream, we have various components to our blood. There is the red blood cells which carry oxygen, the white blood cells which fight infection, and you've got, amongst other things, you've got the plasma, which is essentially the fluid component of the blood. And dissolved within that are various electrolytes, including sodium and potassium, calcium, magnesium. So hyponatremia is where the sodium content of the blood is lower than what we would describe as a normal range. And the trouble with that is that sodium within the body has an effect on the movement of water in and out of cells. So if your sodium in your bloodstream falls too low, essentially what that means is that water from the bloodstream starts leaking out into tissues around the body and can cause swelling in various places. And so that would include swelling in your limbs and in your fingers, but it can also include swelling in other areas such as in the brain, and that can cause symptoms that we have become very familiar with already, such as confusion, nausea, dizziness, vomiting. So hyponatremia is something that we are seeing more these days, I think, because a lot of people are taking up running who don't necessarily know that much running and assume that because they're sweating they need to hydrate more than they would otherwise. And this actually can exacerbate the problem. So by drinking water, you're essentially drinking a pure water that doesn't contain any sodium. And so the effect that has on the bloodstream is to dilute that sodium and cause your sodium to drop. Compounding that is that you're sweating, which means you're losing salt as well. And so that can also compound the problem. You'll see a lot of nutrition drinks and things that advertise isotonic drinks and isotonic gels. And these are possibly slightly better than drinking pure water. However, they have also been associated with causing hyponatremia. So essentially what it boils down to is avoiding over drinking. When you're on any long race, you essentially just need to drink when you're thirsty. Your body has a very, very good inbuilt detector for when you need to drink, and that is, do I feel thirsty? So, taking a massive bottle of water or even sips of water regularly if you're not feeling thirsty isn't necessarily the best way to go. You should drink when you're thirsty and avoid lots and lots of isotonic solutions thinking that's going to be sufficient to counteract the hyponatremia that can happen.
It's so easy when you're in races and there's water stops so regularly to feel like, oh, I need to take this on, it's here, I'll take it because I don't know when it's going to be next. But actually, sometimes you don't need to be drinking as often as the event is supplying.
No, absolutely. And if you think of it this way, every time you have a drink of water, you're essentially making yourself a little bit heavier. And obviously it's harder to run if you're heavy. So the more you sweat, the lighter you get, the easier it is to run, right?
Actually, that's one of the tips for running, not really races so much, but if you're doing long runs yourself, say like in a hot, sunny environment, you can weigh yourself before and after to get an idea of whether you've put weight on, as in drank too much water, or if you've lost a load of weight during that run and lost too much water. You can kind of gauge if you need to be drinking more or less. And then obviously urine as well is a magical thing that we can just look at the colour of our urine and gauge how dehydrated or overhydrated we are.
apart from at altitude in the first 48 hours, because
Yeah.
you're diuresing anyway, so your water's always clear. Your urine's always clear even.
So in summary, it sounds like a lot of these symptoms overlap. So basically anything that's abnormal for you is maybe a reminder to kind of slow down and have a think about what could be going on, and just taking that time to rest and see if you feel better. And if you don't, maybe that's time to speak to medics or stop the race. It's really difficult balance, I think, between, we've spoken about heat exhaustion and becoming dehydrated, and then hyponatremia. So just drinking to thirst, I think, is probably the takeaway message, and acclimatization, whether that's in terms of temperature of the environment you're going to or the altitude, actually taking the time to look after your body and gradually increasing your exertion in these environments so that the race day isn't a big shock. Is there anything else you think are important takeaway messages for people that are signing up to races? We don't want to scare anyone because ultras are amazing things.
I think a very important message we haven't really discussed is actually that all of the things we have discussed are extremes, and they are the things to be aware of and are obviously important. However, they are the extremes, and they are the relative few compared to most people who go and do these races and actually have a really, really good time, a very safe time. And there are so many benefits to running regularly, from improved mental health, reduced incidence of depression, reduced incidence of diabetes. And I was talking about bad knees at the start, and actually there's been loads of studies that have completely debunked this myth. And actually they find that people who run have lower incidence of arthritis in the knees and have improved mobility as they get older. So, there's so many positives to running, and I know we've focused a lot on the dangers and the risks, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that on balance, running is definitely a good thing to be doing, and don't let these risks put you off.
Yeah, and just knowledge is power. So if you know the symptoms and signs, then you know what to look out for, and then you can react.
Exactly.
When it happens. Great, thank you so much.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me on.
If you want to hear more from Nathan, then you can find him on Instagram by searching expedition_doctor. Once again, I just want to reiterate that everything we discussed today is relatively uncommon, and listening to your body is the most important thing that you can do as a runner. All the advice and information that we shared was very general, so if you are planning to take on a big challenge, you should definitely be discussing this with your doctor, and where possible using coaches and other sporting professionals to help you. I'll be back next week with another episode of the podcast, and you can follow me by searching @MarathonMedic. Thank you for listening.